There we go. And then we'll offer some resources and Q&A. What is a sublet? I think I'll let, oh God. What is a sublet? I guess, Mallory, I guess I'll let you start as your first presentation and our fearless leader.
Sure, yeah. So subletting is very common, especially for Northeastern students, given the amount of times they are moving for various opportunities. So, because many students do sign a 12-month lease, which we talked about in our last presentation, subletting allows students a little bit of flexibility if they go away on co op or on study abroad or home for the summer. So, a sublet is when you have a different student or tenant take over your room during your lease term. So you might sign a lease for 12 months, but you're not here in the spring semester, and you find another student that moves in and pays your rent while you're not there. And all of this has to be done within the guidance of the lease and with permission of the landlord. We'll talk more about that.
And how to choose your sublet. So basically, when you're choosing your sublet, it's as Mallory said, you have students that may either be going away or studying abroad, and they don't want to pay for the rent they have for their unit in Boston and also the one wherever they are outside of Boston. And you sublet your apartment because not all leases have the ability for you to end. Actually, very few, as I said before in our earlier presentation, are month-to-month leases in Boston. So you have to sublet. And you want to make sure in your lease that you are allowed to sublet, because first of all, you always need to ask your landlord's permission to sublet in order to legally do so. And the reason for that is because you or the original student on the lease is the person that signed and has their signature on that lease. So in order to sublet and have somebody legally living there, you want to make sure it's allowed, and then you'll sign a sublease contract. And sometimes it may be easier just to find temporary housing instead of subletting if you can't find a sublet, if it's only for a couple months. And you can find temporary housing availabilities on our website. I know we also linked those in an earlier presentation, but it might be easier than subletting sometimes and just finding a temporary accommodation.
Okay, great. So we're going back to our stellar resource, which is the NU database. This is not only for apartment listings and roommates and realtors, but Northeastern students can post their open rooms here and can find open rooms here. And the way to do that is to simply on the housing platform where you can view a map and you can sort listings, you can filter by sublet. So you can find sublet listings from fellow students. You can also use the roommate side and create a profile saying that you have a room available. Or if you're someone seeking a sublet, you can search profiles for people that have a room open as well. So you can either search by I need a room, or I'm the person that has a room, or I need a person that has a room. So those features are really, really nice and can connect students to each other. One thing I want to note is the housing side of our database will show sublets from fellow Northeastern students. The roommate side will open up the search a little bit more to students in other area colleges in Boston. So it does connect across BU, BC, Suffolk, UMass Boston, and a couple other places near our campus.
And for the sublet process, obviously, sublet is a strange word, or at least I've found it a strange word, is because it refers to both the person that needs a room to be filled and the person looking to fill a room. So if you need a room to be filled, as I said before, the first thing you want to do is make sure it's allowed. You want to make sure you have a legal sublet, because once again, the original person who signed the lease is on that name. But if anything happens, you want to know that you're the person that's paying for the sublease. So you need that landlord's permission. It needs to be on the lease. And then you have to kind of determine, as I said in last presentation, what that sublet's fees are. Some places may not have a sublet fee. Some places may have a low sublet fee, and some can be actually up to 1 month's rent to sublet. So it might be too expensive to sublet in some situations, depending on what's written in your lease. And this, as a sublettor, as the person subletting, you also want a copy of the original original lease, because you are now the person that lives on that property. So you still have to abide by all those original rules of the apartment or the unit. So you'll want to see those written out. You'll want a copy of it. You'll want to review those details yourself as well. Subleasing is still an apartment search process, so you should still go through all the other steps we've talked about today and agree to all the terms. You once again want to look at the addenda to see if there's anything you want to negotiate or change, and you want to know when the trash schedule is, when the cleaning schedules are, snow removal, etc., etc. And then you want to kind of get the details out, because you still now need to play the landlord as the new tenant. And how you're going to do it. Is the landlord accepting payment by check, by wire transfer? There are other forms. As long as it's listed on the lease, that's the way that you should pay your landlord. And you want the new kind of agreement, the new contract, the sublease contract, to be written in addition to having the original lease contract, just so that it's all on paper. There's no confusion. All the details are there, and you sort out everything so that you're a legally recognized tenant in the eyes of kind of the city of Boston and the landlord and the other tenant.
Okay, great. So similar to searching for a sublet, if you are searching for someone to take over your room, we have a very similar infographic, so a little chart that students can follow that's on our website. You still want to obtain information, right? So permission from the landlord. So whether you're moving into a room or you're giving up your room to someone else, everyone should make sure that the landlord's permission has been obtained in advance. Even if the lease says subletting is permitted, you still want that written permission for the exact time and person that's planning to move in there. So again, determining what are the landlord's requirements. Is there an application? Is there a fee? And what is needed, I guess, to make this happen and be okay in their eyes. And we do have landlords that are very hands off and really don't care as long as they continue to get paid. And we have those that want students to go through a more formal process with a co-signer involved as well. So you're using the apartment search database again to find somebody. So this would be most useful on the roommate profile side. So searching for a student that needs a room. So needs a room for the spring semester or needs a room for summer. And students can message those students directly and be very proactive and say, hey, I see you need a room. I have a place. I'm leaving if you're interested. So we want to make sure that students are also screening their sublessees because obviously, you're still on the lease. You're still obligated to pay the rent. If anything goes wrong with the sublessee and they leave or they damage the apartment, it's still on the original tenants that are jointly and severally liable to any of those terms. So choose someone that's, responsive, communicative. A lot of times students are finding someone in their friend group, in their academic circles when they can, or within their fraternity or sorority. So there's some kind of common ground there and hopefully someone that you have a certain level of trust with. And so you want to make sure that you and your sublessee are on the same terms and you create a sublet agreement. And on this infographic on our website, we do talk about what should be in a sublet agreement. And this should also be sort of attached to the original lease. So I always say, if you're subletting your room, give your sublessee a copy of your original lease so they can see the other rules of your apartment. Like, what are the trash rules? What are the who's the maintenance contact, all of that information. But things like, how do they get the keys? How do they pay the rent? How do they pay the utilities? And is their furniture included? And so what is the timeline for all of this? Everything should be determined between the two students in that sublet agreement. So sorting out all those details is really important. And we do always recommend that rent is paid directly to the landlord. So there's not a middle person in the way of that. And you don't have to wonder if the rent was paid. There's a direct line of contact there.
And as we stated, and hopefully at this point, our office is here to support any students, any questions you may have about living off campus. The sublet process is probably a little more complex than all the other ones because some places allow sublet, some don't. Some sublet terms are different than others, spring, summer, fall. Intersession, there's like 1 month sublets posted on our Yammer sometimes about just taking over for the intersession period. And yeah, it's just a good way to stay connected. I just referenced our Yammer, and I realized I didn't explain in depth about it, but this post reminded me. A Yammer is basically our student forum about the off-campus process. A lot of students ask each other questions, have general questions. Sometimes you find furniture on there. Sometimes you find surveys. And it's a great resource for students to talk to other students um, about the kind of off-campus process. And you can log in with your Northeastern email, and it's fairly easy to use as a chat forum. Once again, all our information and more can be found on, I sound like an infomercial, on our newsletter. You can also talk with our community ambassadors, and you can follow us on social media. I'm not going to say this one again. I've said it like 3 times this presentation. So, so we do have some time before our last presentation today on renters' rights. So we'll be taking more questions at this point. I'm going to scroll through the chat as well.
Do the sublessee, do they usually have to pay first, last, and security deposit, or is that part of the original renter's agreement?
Do you want? I
I
guess I'll
can
take
chime
that.
in. I can chime in on that.
Okay.
I think it. Sadly, the answer is it depends a little bit. So, um, generally speaking, the current tenants probably paid first, last, and security. But sometimes the student leaving the apartment does want some insurance that that student's going to stay, that they're going to pay rent, or want something to hold them accountable to the apartment. So sometimes they'll ask maybe for the last month's rent. We have heard from the city of Boston in previous meetings that current tenants aren't really supposed to be acting as landlords and taking a security deposit. And the security deposit can't be taken from the landlord a second time. So the landlord already has a security deposit, so they shouldn't be collecting additional funds for security from the sublet. But I would think that something like first month's last month might be something the students work out amongst themselves. But the landlord shouldn't require that because they've already received those payments from the current tenants.
Would the landlord ever return the original renter's security and say, "Oh, now you gotta pay me the security"? I guess that's where it depends from.
Yeah, so not necessarily. So the security deposit is not supposed to be returned until the end of the original lease document. So the sublet is pretty much separate to that. The master and original lease is always what kind of reigns supreme. So the landlord is not going to give someone's security deposit back in January because they're subletting to someone else. That student is still going to have to wait until the end of the lease, whether it's in May or August, to receive their security deposit back.
It looks like the question about February or March sublets. I would say it's less common, but it's not. I mean, we've seen them, but generally sublets start at the beginning of each semester, fall, spring, or summer. But you do, as I said earlier, you do see some uncommon ones mixed in, like intersession sublets. You do get like a couple. February and March. I'm not quite sure about that timeline, but you do get some on off cycles that aren't spring, fall, or summer. And yeah, the furniture one about the sublet, the summer sublet is usually agreed upon. I know, I mean, I know most cases the student leaves their furniture. It's more of a hassle to remove it and put it back than it is the moving cost, and the time it takes to do that alone is usually not worth it. But that has to be agreed upon in the sublease contract of where that furniture to go. Mallory, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say too that that's exactly right, Chester. I think most people include it, but what I was thinking too is because leases end in August, it will be important that all roommates and sublessees are sort of on the same page as to how to remove all the furniture at the end of the tenancy, so there's nothing left in the apartment, because landlords will often charge or deduct from the security deposit if things are left behind, and they have to remove them. So just something to keep in mind if they aren't renewing the lease for next year and everything needs to be cleared out.
Yeah, and no subleases are the same because there's so many different small things to talk about, like furniture. I think there was a question about generic subleases. No sublease agreements are the same. Unlike the standard lease, which the Boston has a template for that many students use, the sublease agreements change because the fees change depending on the lease, the time of year changes. There's just so many different factors that there's no generic sublease contract. So you want to make sure just with the original lease, all the details are in that sublease contract about what's going on, time of payment, getting all that original information. And that's just to protect everybody involved, both the original renter and the sublessor, sublessee, subletter. I never know the correct conjugation of the word. But okay, let's
I was
see.
just responding to the next one too, Chester, about fall co-op cycles. I don't know if we really spoke to this yet. So, and maybe it's a direct message to me actually, but I'd like to bring it up for everybody. So, there are students obviously that will be looking for co-ops that start in July, and they don't know if they're going to be in Boston or not. But we're telling people, you kind of need to sign a lease probably in April or by April to get something that you want. So I think that does pose a challenge. So if your student is not sure where they're going to be on co-op, they could wait and not sign anything and have their roommate sort of move forward without them, but they could find themselves in a predicament where then they're trying to find temporary or short-term housing or last minute housing. So it might be better to find a lease with the most, I guess, agreeable sublease terms that are simple, that are hopefully affordable as far as the fee goes, because then they can sublet out their room from September to December. There's always a lot of students actually looking for fall sublets, and fall sublets can be kind of hard to find. So it just be something that roommates kind of need to talk about in advance, that that's a possibility, and consider that when doing their lease review.
And then there's a question about roommates. And as much as we want to be able to control roommate and roommate kind of relationships, I think very few leases, I have seen one actually, where in the sublease addenda for the original lease, it says that all the original roommates have to agree on the subletter as well. But that's not something that has to happen. As long as legally they're an adult, can make the payment, and the original renter and the subletter agree, and the landlord agrees, a new person can sublease an apartment. Usually